This is Star Wars for the Nintendo Entertainment System, an adequate little game based on the first Star Wars movie with some minor issues here and there, but an otherwise entirely playable game and probably the best Star Wars game on the NES, which probably isn't saying much when your other options on the console are the less than stellar Famicom release from Namco and the somewhat wretched Empire Strikes Back video game that came along much later. Now what if, for whatever reason, you wanted to take this game with you on the go? Portable NES units were not a thing as they are today, but you did have an alternative, and that was Star Wars for Nintendo Game Boy, courtesy of Capcom, later Ubisoft, and even recently with limited run games via this release in an action figure cardboard setup, which looks pretty stupid and not in a good way either, but whatever. Anyways, if you've not played Star Wars on the NES, I did a review on this I think last year, but I'll give you a quick refresher regardless. You begin the game as Luke Skywalker and you start on Tatooine, where you drive your land speeder to different caves and locations in order to collect shields and allies. You could find R2-D2 in the Sandcrawler, Obi-Wan Kenobi and a lightsaber in some random cave somewhere. Han Solo resides in the Mos Eisley Cantina and is your second playable character. And then it's off to Docking Bay 94, where you board the Millennium Falcon and you navigate the asteroid field that was once the planet Alderaan. You board the Death Star, you rescue playable character number 3 Princess Leia, escape the Death Star, engage in some TIE Fighter dogfights, fly an X-Wing down the trench, blow up the Death Star, the end. Star Wars on Game Boy is pretty much the same game as it appeared on the NES, with pretty much the same level layouts, play mechanics, more or less, visual and audio elements, more or less, and the overall structure, but somewhat lacking in the quality control. As a result, there are a number of issues that affect playability in this Game Boy iteration of Star Wars, not the least of which involves controls and physics. Star Wars on the NES was a platformer. You need to run and jump in order to reach far-off platforms, as well as climb ladders and make use of gravity chutes to propel you to the high ground, where it is all over once you have it. Allegedly. Control wasn't the best in that version, but at least it worked enough that the challenges within the game could be reasonably conquered. Star Wars on Game Boy, on the other hand, is hampered by poor control and otherwise floaty physics that make what were once somewhat effortless platforming endeavors into gargantuan tasks. Gravity chutes function differently in that you need to hold the jump button down to propel you higher up. No such action was needed in the console version, and they still functioned much better than they do here. This is all before taking into account the reduced visibility of the playfield due to the lower resolution of the Game Boy screen, which makes traversing these levels a bit more dangerous. Collision detection also has a tendency to be a bit finicky, particularly when using your lightsaber, which has a somewhat short range, which makes it a bit of a dangerous weapon to use. However, it can kill almost everything with a single blow, so there's a bit of a risk versus reward element, even if half the enemies in the game can easily return the favor in a couple hits, even with a full health bar. The falling damage you receive after falling from a great distance is still in the game, though it is not as fatal as the NES version. There are a multitude of issues that plague the main platforming segments of Star Wars, ranging from minor quibbles to generally grievous flaws. Taking what was a generally fun yet challenging romp on the NES and turning it into a damn near torture session on the Game Boy. But then there are the cockpit segments where you're flying the Millennium Falcon through the asteroid field or dogfighting with TIE fighters. And to this version's credit, those work well enough. Moving the crosshairs is easy enough, not too fast, not too slow. Aiming is fine if not perfect. Control in this regard is surprisingly much more functional than the portion that makes up the good majority of the game, which, quite frankly, I've got nothing really. I really don't. For what it's worth, the graphical quality of Star Wars on the Game Boy is almost on par with that of the NES version. There are some sacrifices, of course. The cutscenes are generally blocks of text with occasional mugshots, the sprite work is a bit rough around the edges, and sometimes your health meter tends to blend in with backgrounds on some stages, but all things considered, the downscaling didn't lose too much. There's a lot of background and block detailing, the animation on the players are still pretty solid, and the heads-up display on the dogfighting segments aren't too shabby either. It's not the prettiest looking thing, but it gets the job done, so that's one for Star Wars on the Game Boy. Probably the only one, I think. Meanwhile, on the audio front, sound effects are a bit on the subpar side of things even by Game Boy standards. About half the game's soundtrack made the transition from NES to Game Boy, most of the important tracks I suppose. The tracks that did make the cut are of a somewhat lesser quality. They sound okay-ish, but not as good, but then again, what do I know? These lesser tracks would eventually get reused in the Game Boy port of Empire Strikes Back, and someday we'll get to that one at some point. Maybe when Disney decides to reboot the whole damn franchise and just start from scratch, which honestly isn't such a bad idea at the moment, but I digress. So Star Wars on Game Boy was a rather painful experience, primarily because it's a bad port of what I thought was a pretty decent offering on the NES, which I enjoyed quite a bit, but even on its own merits, it's still pretty awful. Control, physics, and wonky collision are the main culprits in this disturbance in the Force, and quite honestly, would have been one of the worst Star Wars games I've played on the portable front, not for the fact that I've played a much worse game on the Game Boy Advance. Actually, I may have played 2 worse games on the GBA. Maybe 3. But we don't need to revisit those monstrosities ever again. Once is more than enough. Bottom line, if this game looks interesting, just play it on the NES. It's a much better version. And if you really want to play a portable version of this game, I hear the Game Gear version's actually pretty good, but I wouldn't know. As far as this is concerned, don't bother. It's not worth it. Not even for that cardboard action figure thing. Why is that even a thing?
I just want to add this one last point as an addendum to all those folks who go to those old GBA Star Wars reviews and they complain about, well, they're GBA titles, what did you expect, that sort of thing. I have here 2 of the shittiest Star Wars games on the Game Boy, and I'd much rather be playing those than these piles of shit. Some food for thought. Bye!